At 2:07 a.m., she was demoted without warning from VP to special advisor. No explanation, no meeting, just a one-line Slack message. At 2:08, she typed a single word, understood. At 2:11, she unplugged her laptop, and by the time the CEO woke up, she had already frozen $4.7 billion in active capital reserves across 6 jurisdictions. This isn't a story of rage, it's a story of precision, of loyalty betrayed, of one quiet woman who knew exactly where the company's bones were buried, because she helped build the skeleton. Evelyn Ward had always been a light sleeper. 20 years in corporate law does that to you, trains your body to wake at the slightest vibration of a phone, the faintest ping of an urgent email. But at 2:07 a.m., on a Tuesday in March, it wasn't her usual work phone that lit up, it was her personal device, the one only a handful of people had access to. The notification banner glowed harsh against the darkness of her bedroom, CEO Admin Bot. I sat up, my heart already knowing what my mind refused to process. In 19 years at Volantech Systems, I'd received exactly 3 messages from that bot. The first announced my promotion to senior counsel. The second elevated me to vice president of legal and financial compliance. The third, effective immediately. Your role is being transitioned to strategic advisor. More details to follow. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the 4,937 days I'd given to this company. No mention of the regulatory frameworks I'd built from scratch. The international compliance structures that had saved Volantech from federal investigations 3 times over. Or the fact that I was the only executive who knew where every financial body was buried because I'd been the one holding the shovel. Strategic advisor. In corporate speak, it was barely a step above consultant. In reality, it was a parking lot for executives they wanted to force out quietly. My fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard. 19 years of measured responses, of diplomatic emails crafted at all hours, of careful legal language designed to protect the company I'd helped build from the ground up. 19 years of being the adult in the room when startup bros wanted to cut corners, of being labeled overcautious and risk-averse when I insisted on following international banking regulations. I typed one word, understood. Then I set the phone aside and stood up. No trembling hands, no tears, just the cold clarity that comes when betrayal arrives dressed in corporate efficiency. My home office was exactly as I'd left it 6 hours earlier, legal briefs stacked in order of priority. 3 monitors displaying Volantech's compliance dashboards. The small cactus my daughter gave me when I made VP still thriving despite my black thumb. But now I saw it differently. Now I saw the room for what it truly was, a shrine to misplaced loyalty. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one with the biometric lock I'd installed myself. Inside sat a single USB drive, unremarkable in appearance but containing something far more valuable than company secrets. It held the complete internal legal framework I'd authored over 2 decades, every policy, every international banking arrangement, every carefully crafted loophole and safeguard. More importantly, it contained the original incorporation documents I'd drafted in 2005, back when Volantech was just 3 guys in a Denver loft who needed someone to make their revolutionary fintech idea legal. Documents that included certain provisions I'd insisted upon, provisions they'd laughed about at the time, calling me paranoid for wanting emergency protocols in case of executive malfeasance. "You're thinking like a lawyer, not a partner," the original CEO had said. "That's exactly what you're paying me to do," I'd replied. He'd signed, they'd all signed, and then they'd forgotten. The way executives always forget the boring legal details once the money starts flowing. I pulled out my personal laptop, not the company machine with its monitoring software and remote wipe capabilities, but the one I'd maintained separately, backing up every crucial document through encrypted channels that IT would never think to look for, because I'd been the one to design their security protocols in the first place. The Denver skyline glittered beyond my window. Volantech's headquarters tower standing tall among them, its top floors still dark at this ungodly hour. Somewhere in that building, someone had made the decision to dispose of me like outdated software. Someone had looked at my 19 years of service and seen not an asset but an obstacle to their vision of Volantech's future. They'd probably celebrated, maybe opened champagne. Chase Loring, our new boy wonder CEO with his Stanford MBA and his TED Talks about disrupting disruption, had probably high-fived his inner circle of yes-men. He'd been circling me like a vulture for months, making snide comments about legacy thinking and pre-digital mindsets in board meetings. "Evelyn is brilliant," he'd said at the last quarterly review, his smile sharp as glass. "But sometimes I wonder if we need brilliance from the last decade when we're building for the next one." I'd smiled back, professional as always, and made a note in my personal files, just as I'd made notes of every questionable decision, every corner cut, every time Chase had asked me to find a workaround for regulatory requirements. He thought I was a dinosaur. He was about to learn that dinosaurs became oil, and oil, when properly refined, could burn down entire worlds. I opened the encrypted folder labeled Legacy 001. Inside were contracts, certificates, and most crucially, the emergency compliance protocols I'd established across 6 international jurisdictions: Zurich, Singapore, the Caymans, Dublin, Hong Kong, Toronto, in each location. I'd built in what I called circuit breakers, legal mechanisms that could freeze assets if triggered by specific conditions related to fraud, regulatory violations, or material breaches of fiduciary duty. It had taken me 3 years to implement them all, working quietly with international banking partners who trusted my reputation more than they'd ever trust Volantech's. They'd seen too many fintech companies implode from regulatory scandals. When I'd approached them about safeguards, they'd been eager to participate. "Smart thinking, Evelyn," the Zurich branch director had said. "Your executives should appreciate having someone who thinks 10 moves ahead." They should have. They didn't. I pulled up the email addresses I needed. Not the corporate ones that would leave digital footprints in Volantech's servers, but the private channels I'd cultivated over the years. Banking relationships built on mutual respect and off-the-record conversations in Geneva conference rooms. Legal partnerships forged over decades of shared cases and careful navigation of international finance law. 3 emails. That's all it would take. 3 carefully worded messages invoking provisions that had been sleeping in contracts for years, waiting for exactly this moment. I paused, my fingers poised over the keyboard. Once I pressed send, there would be no going back. No graceful exit with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. No LinkedIn post about exciting new opportunities and grateful for my time at Volantech. But then I thought about the 2:07 a.m. timing, the cowardice of it, the casual cruelty of reducing 19 years to an automated message in the middle of the night. They couldn't even face me in person, couldn't even pretend to care about the human being behind the title. Strategic advisor. I almost laughed. They wanted my strategic advice. I'd give them the kind of strategy Sun Tzu would have admired winning the war before the enemy even knows they're in battle. The USB drive went back in the drawer. Everything I needed was already backed up in places they'd never think to look. I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen, where I made myself a cup of tea with the methodical precision of someone who has all the time in the world. Because I did. They thought they'd ambushed me. They thought surprise was their advantage. They had no idea that I'd been preparing for this moment since the day I'd walked into that Denver loft and shook hands with founders too young to know why they needed someone like me. Now they were about to learn. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window as I sipped my 3rd cup of tea, watching Denver wake up 20 floors below. It was 6:30 a.m. now, and I hadn't slept. Instead, I'd been remembering, 20 years is a long time to build armor, even longer when you're the only woman in rooms full of men who mistake your caution for weakness. I was 23 when I first walked into Volantech's predecessor company, back when it was called Digital Velocity and operated out of a converted warehouse, fresh out of Yale Law, top of my class, with offers from white shoe firms in New York. But something about those 3 founders in their cramped Denver office had intrigued me. They had vision. They had drive. What they didn't have was any understanding of how to build a financial technology company without ending up in federal prison. We need someone who gets it. Marcus, the original CEO, had said during my interview, someone who can keep up with how fast we're moving but also keep us from driving off a cliff. I'd taken the job, becoming the fourth employee and the first person in the company who owned a suit that wasn't bought for a funeral. Those early years were battlefield training. I learned to translate between languages not French to English or Spanish to Mandarin, but the far more complex translation between startup enthusiasm and regulatory reality. When the engineers wanted to process payments instantly without verification, I was the one explaining why the Bank Secrecy Act existed. When sales promised features that would violate international data privacy laws, I was the one finding compliant alternatives. They called me the compliance queen back then, half mockery, half grudging respect. I wore it like a badge of honor. But being the sole woman in those conference rooms taught me other lessons too. I learned that my ideas would often be ignored until repeated by a male colleague. I learned that aggressive in a man was abrasive in a woman. I learned that building frameworks and safeguards was seen as less valuable than building code or closing deals until something went wrong. And things did go wrong. Oh, how they went wrong. 2009 nearly killed us. A junior developer had pushed code that accidentally exposed transaction data for 300,000 users. The breach lasted exactly 17 minutes before I caught it. During a routine compliance check. 17 minutes that could have cost us everything: our licenses, our reputation, our future. I worked 72 hours straight, coordinating with federal regulators, managing the disclosure process, and implementing new protocols to ensure it never happened again. I slept under my desk. I lived on energy drinks and determination. I saved the company. The board gave Marcus a bonus for his crisis leadership. I got a pat on the head and a reminder that we're all on the same team here. That's when I started building my shields. The first shield was knowledge. I didn't just learn financial compliance, I mastered it. International banking law, cryptocurrency regulations before anyone knew what Bitcoin was. Every update to Dodd-Frank and MiFID II. I attended conferences in Zurich and Singapore, not for the networking, but for the education. I became fluent in the language of global finance. The second shield was relationships. While my colleagues were burning bridges with regulators, I was building them. I had coffee with SEC investigators, lunch with Federal Reserve auditors, dinner with compliance officers from the world's largest banks. They knew me as the woman who made their jobs easier, who provided documentation before they asked for it, who never tried to hide problems but instead came with solutions. If every fintech company had an Evelyn Ward, one regulator told me, we could cut our investigation department in half. But the third shield that was the masterpiece, that was the shield I forged in the depths of 2013, when Volantech went through its first major restructuring. We'd grown too fast, expanded into markets we didn't understand. The board brought in outside consultants who recommended right-sizing the legal department. Translation: they wanted to fire half my team and outsource our compliance to the lowest bidder. I fought it, of course. Presented data showing how internal compliance had saved us millions in potential fines. Demonstrated how our perfect regulatory record had opened doors that were closed to our competitors. But the new board members, drunk on disruption theory and cost-cutting mantras, wouldn't listen. Evelyn, Marcus had said, looking tired and older than his 40 years. Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war. So I lost the battle. Let them cut my team. Smiled politely as they brought in consultants who didn't know a regulatory filing from a grocery list. And while they celebrated their Pyrrhic victory, I quietly began implementing what I called the Dead Man's Switch Protocol. It started simple. Every international banking relationship we established, I insisted on compliance safeguards. Nothing unusual there, standard practice for risk mitigation, but buried in the language of those agreements were provisions that gave extraordinary power to the chief compliance officer in cases of suspected fraud or regulatory breach, power to freeze assets, power to demand immediate audit, power to lock down entire financial pipelines until investigations were complete. The beauty was in the structure. These weren't Volantech's direct agreements. They were third-party banking relationships that Volantech depended on, but didn't directly control. The company needed these banks more than the banks needed Volantech. And the banks, they trusted me more than they'd ever trust a rotating cast of CEOs and board members. "This seems like overkill," the CFO had said when reviewing one particularly complex arrangement with our Zurich partners. "It's insurance," I'd replied. "The kind you hope you never need." He'd signed off, already thinking about his next quarterly earnings call. They all signed off, every time, because I'd trained them to see me as overcautious, risk-averse, paranoid about compliance. They'd roll their eyes at Evelyn being Evelyn and sign whatever I put in front of them, confident that the compliance queen was just building another layer of unnecessary protection. They never asked who was being protected. They never wondered why someone so risk-averse would insist on provisions that gave one person always the chief compliance officer, never the CEO or board unilateral power to act in emergencies. They never considered that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't protecting the company. I was protecting the company from itself. By 2016, I'd built circuit breakers into every major financial channel Volantech used. Swiss accounts that could be frozen with a single encrypted email. Singapore holdings that required my personal verification every 30 days or automatically locked. Cayman Island structures that treated any change in my employment status as a potential breach requiring immediate asset protection. It was elegant, it was bulletproof, it was invisible. And it was necessary, because I'd watched too many companies destroy themselves from the inside, watched founders push out the people who'd built their success, watched boards sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gains, watched new executives arrive with promises of transformation that usually transformed into scandals, investigations, and bankruptcy. I'd seen the pattern too many times bring in the adults to build the company, then dismiss them as outdated when you want to break the rules they created. Well, I'd built the rules, and I'd built them with teeth. Standing in my kitchen that morning, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, I felt the weight of those 20 years, every document drafted, every crisis averted, every shield carefully forged and positioned. I'd given Volantech my youth, my expertise, my loyalty. I'd made myself indispensable. And that, I realized, had been my only real mistake, because in corporate America, indispensable is just another word for target. But they'd chosen the wrong target. They'd aimed at what they thought was an aging compliance officer, risk-averse and easily dismissed. They had no idea they were aiming at a fortress, Chase Loring. Even the name sounded like something generated by an AI trying to create the perfect startup CEO. 37 years old. Stanford MBA, former Google product manager turned serial entrepreneur, though his version of serial entrepreneurship involved burning through 3 startups in 5 years, each one failing upward into a better position. I'd first met him 18 months ago when the board brought him in as Chief Innovation Officer, a title that meant nothing and everything. Within 6 months, he'd orchestrated a coup against Marcus, convincing the board that Volantech needed fresh blood and digital native leadership. Marcus, tired from 20 years of building and fighting, had taken his golden parachute and retired to Aspen. Chase's first all-hands meeting as CEO had been a masterclass in corporate theater. He'd worn jeans and a black turtleneck because apparently stealing Steve Jobs' aesthetic counted as innovation, and talked about radical transformation and breakthrough velocity for 45 minutes without saying anything concrete. "We need to move at the speed of thought," he'd proclaimed, standing in front of a slide that just said, "Disrupt or die," in 100-point font. I'd sat in the back row, taking notes on my legal pad, watching our engineers exchange worried glances. They knew, as I did, that speed of thought usually translated to ignore the rules. The first clash came 3 weeks into his tenure. Chase wanted to launch a peer-to-peer lending feature that would let users loan money internationally without what he called friction. "The compliance process is the friction," he'd said during the product meeting, his frustration barely concealed. "Evelyn, we need you to find a way to make this work. not find reasons it won't. International money transmission without proper licensing isn't friction-free, I'd replied calmly. It's federal prison. He'd actually laughed, and turned to his entourage of yes-men he'd imported from his last failed venture. This is what I'm talking about, legacy thinking. In the time it takes legal to approve something, our competitors have already shipped and captured the market. Our competitors who are currently under federal investigation, I'd asked. The room had gone quiet. Chase's jaw had tightened. That telltale muscle twitch that appeared whenever someone challenged his vision. We'll table this for now, he'd said. But Evelyn, I need you to start thinking more like a partner and less like a hall monitor. Hall monitor. I'd been called worse by better men. Over the following months, Chase had systematically surrounded himself with people who wouldn't challenge him. The new CFO was a 32-year-old wunderkind who thought regulations were guidelines. The head of product was Chase's former roommate from Stanford. The board, dazzled by Chase's promises of a billion-dollar IPO, rubber-stamped every decision. But it was the small cruelties that revealed his true nature. The way he'd schedule optional meetings during my daughter's school events. The way he'd exclude me from strategy sessions, then blame me for being out of the loop. The way he'd publicly question whether we needed such a robust legal department in the modern agile environment. I'm not saying Evelyn isn't brilliant. He'd told the board during a review I wasn't supposed to know about. But corporate secrets have a way of finding their way to the person who knows where all the recording devices are. But she's software from a different era. We're running iOS 17 and she's still on Windows 95. Clever metaphor. Wrong, but clever. I wasn't outdated software. I was the firewall. And he was malware trying to convince the system to lower its defenses. The IPO announcement had been the beginning of the end. $18 billion valuation. Chase had promised revolutionary technology that would democratize global finance. The board was ecstatic. The employees were counting their stock options. And I was reading through the S1 filing preparation documents, finding violation after violation. Hidden subsidiaries in jurisdictions we weren't licensed to operate. Revenue recognition that would make Arthur Anderson blush. User numbers that included test accounts and bots. The kind of creative accounting that worked fine in a private company, but would implode under SEC scrutiny. I tried the proper channels first, wrote a 17-page memo detailing every issue, every risk, every potential felony charge, sent it to Chase, the board, the audit committee, even sent a copy to our external law firm to create an undeniable paper trail. Chase's response had come in our next one-on-one meeting. Evelyn, he'd said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair that cost more than most people's cars. I appreciate your thoroughness. Really, I do. But you need to understand that the old rules don't apply anymore. We're not just disrupting financial services, we're disrupting the very concept of compliance. You can't disrupt federal law, I'd said. Can't. He'd smiled that Silicon Valley smile, all teeth and no soul. Or won't see. That's the difference between you and me. You see walls, I see doors. I see prison bars, I'd replied. His smile had faltered. You know what, you're right. You do see prison bars. You see threats everywhere. You see problems instead of opportunities. And that kind of thinking, it's contagious. It's toxic to innovation. That's when I'd known. The memo hadn't been a warning to him. It had been evidence. Evidence that I was a roadblock to his vision. Evidence that I needed to be removed before the IPO process began in earnest. I'd started documenting everything after that meeting. Every request to bypass compliance. Every attempt to hide problematic data. Every communication suggesting I was being deliberately excluded from critical decisions. My personal backup system worked overtime, capturing emails and Slack messages that had a curious habit of being deleted from company servers. Why do you even stay? My daughter had asked during one of our weekly dinners, watching me respond to emails between courses. They clearly don't appreciate you. Because someone has to guard the gates, I'd told her, even when the barbarians are already inside. She'd rolled her eyes, 25 and working at a nonprofit. She thought my corporate loyalty was misplaced. She wasn't wrong. But I'd stayed anyway, partly out of duty to the employees who'd lose everything if Chase's house of cards collapsed, partly out of sheer stubbornness, and partly because I'd known this day would come, the day when Chase would finally move against me, the day when he'd decide the compliance queen had to be dethroned before she could interfere with his coronation as the boy king of a fraudulent empire. I'd even predicted the timing. Late night, when he thought I'd be vulnerable, through digital channels, to avoid confrontation, framed as a transition rather than a termination to avoid triggering employment law protections. Strategic advisor, meaningless title, no actual power, designed to force me to quit in frustration while making it look like they'd kept me on. What he hadn't predicted was that I'd been playing chess while he'd been playing checkers. He thought he was removing an obstacle. He had no idea he was triggering an avalanche. Standing in my home office, I pulled up the organizational chart I'd maintained privately. The real one showing how Volantech's financial structure actually worked versus the sanitized version Chase showed to investors. $16 billion in assets under management, but distributed across dozens of entities in 6 jurisdictions, each entity connected to the others through a web of agreements, partnerships, and regulatory requirements. And threaded through each connection, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, were my circuit breakers. Chase thought he was the spider in this web. He was about to learn he was just another fly. I opened my secure laptop and began composing the first email. Not to him, he wasn't worth the dignity of direct communication. Instead, I wrote to the one person at Volantech who might still have both integrity and influence, Sarah Martinez, head of internal audit, one of the few executives who'd survived Chase's purge by being too competent to fire. Sarah, I typed, by now you've heard about my transition to strategic advisor. I wanted to ensure a smooth handover of my compliance responsibilities. Attached is a complete overview of our international banking relationships and their associated compliance requirements. Please note sections 7 through 15, which detail the automatic triggers that activate if certain conditions aren't met. As these were implemented under my authority, they'll need immediate attention to prevent any disruptions. I'm available if you need clarification, though I suspect my new advisory role may limit my access to necessary systems. Best regards, Evelyn. I attached the 847-page document I'd prepared months ago for exactly this moment. Buried in subsection after subsection of mind-numbing legalese were the details of every trap I'd laid. Sarah was smart enough to find them. Whether she'd be fast enough to defuse them was another question. But I wasn't counting on her to defuse them. I was counting on her to panic, to escalate, to create a paper trail showing that Volantech's leadership had been warned about what was coming. Because in 12 hours, when the banks opened in Zurich, the first circuit breaker would trip, and once it started, the cascade would be unstoppable. Chase Loring thought he was Steve Jobs. He was about to discover he was more like Elizabeth Holmes, a cautionary tale waiting to be written, and I would be the one holding the pen. The folder was labeled Legacy 001 for a reason. It was my legacy, not what I'd leave behind, but what I'd carry forward. Every document inside had been encrypted twice, stored on servers that Volantech's IT department didn't even know existed. The beauty of designing a company's security architecture is knowing exactly where to hide things from the people who inherited your design. I entered my 32-character password, then the biometric scan, then the 2-factor authentication from a phone number registered to a trust in Delaware. Paranoid, perhaps, but paranoia had kept me employed for 19 years and was about to keep me out of prison while ensuring others might not be so lucky. The first document appeared International Banking Framework V47.3, Confidential, EVP Eyes Only. I'd written the first version in 2006, back when Volantech was still trying to figure out how to move money across borders without triggering every anti-terrorism law on the books. Version 47 had been completed just 6 months ago, when I'd sensed the winds changing and Chase's appetite for disruption growing beyond sustainable bounds. The framework was a masterpiece of legal engineering, if I did say so myself, 137 pages of dense technical language that described every international banking relationship Volantech maintained. But the real artistry was in the footnotes, the subsections, the clauses that referenced other clauses that referenced international banking law, that referenced specific regulatory frameworks in specific jurisdictions. Clause 17.4.I was my favorite. In the event of material change in compliance leadership, all Category A financial instruments shall enter protective status pending verification of regulatory adherence, with automatic escalation to relevant oversight bodies as per Schedule J. Translation: if I got fired, the money stopped moving. But it was more elegant than that. The clause didn't specify termination or removal. It said, material change. Being demoted to strategic advisor, that was definitely a material change. And because the clause was embedded in third-party banking agreements, not internal Volantech policies, Chase couldn't simply override it with executive authority. The banks had agreed to these terms. The banks had insisted on them. Actually, after I'd spent 3 years cultivating relationships and explaining the risks of working with American fintech companies. We've seen what happens when compliance leadership changes suddenly. Hans Gruber, my contact at the Zurich branch, had said over dinner in 2017, "One day you have professionals who understand the law. The next day you have cowboys who think, move fast and break things applies to international banking." What would make you feel secure? I'd asked, already knowing the answer because I'd spent 6 months guiding him to it. Continuity, he'd said. Guarantees that if the adults leave the room, we can protect ourselves. The resulting agreement had been a thing of beauty. 17 pages of risk mitigation that essentially gave their bank kill switches over 40% of Volantech's operational capital if certain conditions were met. Conditions that I'd carefully crafted to seem reasonable, even conservative. The Singapore agreement was even better. Written in the wake of the Wirecard scandal, it included provisions for automated compliance verification that required my personal cryptographic signature every 30 days. Miss one verification. The accounts entered a 7-day grace period. Miss the grace period. Full freeze pending regulatory review that could take 6 to 8 months. I checked my calendar. The last verification had been 20 days ago. In 10 days, if I did nothing, $2.1 billion in Asian market reserves would lock automatically. But why wait? I opened the next document. Emergency Compliance Protocol, Cayman Islands Holdings. This one had been almost too easy. Cayman banks were so paranoid about being used for money laundering that they'd practically begged for more oversight mechanisms. I'd given them a framework that would make a TSA agent proud. Section 23 was the key. Upon credible indication of potential regulatory violation or compromise of compliance infrastructure, the compliance officer of record may invoke Emergency Protocol 7, resulting in immediate asset protection pending investigation by appropriate authorities. Credible indication, such flexible language. A CEO known for pushing legal boundaries suddenly removing the head of compliance before a major IPO. That certainly seemed credible to me. The Dublin structure was more subtle. European Union banking regulations required notification of significant changes in compliance leadership within 48 hours. Failure to notify triggered automatic reviews. Reviews triggered holds. Holds triggered investigations. Investigations triggered journalists. It was a beautiful cascade of consequences, all from failing to file one form. But the real coup de grace was hidden in the Hong Kong arrangements. During the protests of 2019, I'd negotiated special provisions for political risk mitigation. Buried in those provisions was language about protecting against internal political changes that might affect regulatory compliance. The beauty was that Hong Kong banks, already nervous about their relationship with mainland China, interpreted political very broadly. A coup against compliant leadership, that was political, and the Hong Kong banking authorities' response to political risk was swift and unforgiving: freeze first, ask questions later. The Toronto structure was the newest, implemented just 8 months ago, when Chase had started making noise about expanding aggressively into copyright-friendly markets. I'd insisted on compliance frameworks that aligned with Canadian banking law, which was notoriously strict about executive accountability. The provisions I'd embedded there weren't just circuit breakers, they were legal time bombs that would trigger personal liability for any executive who'd signed off on non-compliant transactions. Guess whose signature was on every major transaction approval for the last year? Chase Loring, who'd insisted on being hands-on with everything, who'd wanted his name on every deal to build his reputation as a transformational leader. I pulled up the final document in the folder, Succession Planning and Compliance Continuity. This was the document I'd presented to the board 3 years ago, full of reasonable-sounding proposals about ensuring smooth transitions and preventing disruption to operations. They'd approved it without reading past the executive summary, pleased that I was thinking about succession planning, never realizing I was planning for their succession, not mine. The plan included automated notifications to regulatory bodies in case of sudden compliance leadership changes. It mandated external audits triggered by specific events. It required disclosure to banking partners within rigid timeframes. And failure to follow the plan, which was about to happen because no one except me knew it existed, would trigger breach of contract provisions across every major financial relationship Volantech maintained. I leaned back in my chair, admiring the architecture of what I'd built. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't even personal. Really, it was just the logical consequence of building a compliance framework so robust, so interconnected, so dependent on continuity, that removing its architect would cause the whole structure to collapse. They'd wanted me to build them a fortress. They just never asked who held the keys. My phone buzzed. Sarah Martinez, right on schedule. Evelyn, I just got your email. This document. Are these triggers real? The Zurich provisions alone could freeze half our operating capital. I typed back calmly. All very real, I'm afraid. I've been meaning to simplify the structure, but as you know, my role has recently changed. I'm not sure I'll have the access or authority to prevent the automatic triggers from engaging. Perhaps Chase has a plan. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Sarah was panicking. I could tell. She was smart enough to understand the implications, but not experienced enough to know how to stop it. When do the first triggers hit? She finally asked. I glanced at my world clock display. Zurich would open in 11 hours, Singapore in 8, Hong Kong in 7. The automated systems check for compliance verification at market open in each jurisdiction, I replied. I used to handle these personally, but I'm not sure my new advisory role includes system access. You should probably escalate this to Chase immediately. He doesn't get in until 10, she wrote back. I smiled. Of course he didn't. The boy king liked his beauty sleep, liked rolling in after his morning workout and green juice, usually closer to 10:30. By then, 3 markets would have already opened. 3 circuit breakers would have already tripped. Perhaps try his cell, I suggested innocently. I don't have it. Do you? Did I have Chase Loring's personal cell phone number? Of course I did. I had everyone's personal information. It was part of being thorough. But share it with Sarah so she could wake him up and potentially give him time to respond. I'm afraid I don't, I typed, but I'm sure someone in the C-suite does. Best of luck. Sarah, I'm here if you need me, though as I mentioned, my access may be limited. I set the phone aside and returned to my documents. There were emails to draft, notifications to send to my personal legal team because of course I had one, retained with my own funds, attorney-client privilege fully intact. They would need to be ready when Volantech inevitably tried to blame me for the collapse that was about to occur. But that would come later. For now, I had 10 hours to prepare for the most expensive I told you so in fintech history. I pulled up one last file, one that wasn't about banking or compliance or legal frameworks. It was a simple spreadsheet showing every time I'd been overruled, dismissed, or ignored when warning about risks. Every decision that prioritized growth over governance. Every moment when they'd chosen Chase's vision over my caution. 137 incidents over 18 months, each one documented, dated, and verified. They'd wanted to move fast and break things. They were about to learn that sometimes The things that break can't be put back together. The emails had to be perfect. Not legally perfect, that was the easy part. They had to be perfect in their mundane professionalism, their utter lack of drama. When investigators eventually reviewed the digital trail, they needed to see a consummate professional doing her duty, not a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. I opened my encrypted email client, the one that routed through servers in Switzerland not for secrecy, but for the timestamp authenticity that Swiss data laws provided. Electronic evidence from Swiss servers was nearly impossible to challenge in court. The first email was to Hans Gruber in Zurich, my contact at Swiss Federated Bank. I'd known Hans for 12 years, ever since he'd helped Volantech navigate the labyrinth of Swiss banking regulations. He appreciated precision, despised ambiguity, and had once told me that Americans had turned banking into gambling. "Dear Hans," I typed, keeping my tone professional but warm, "I hope this finds you well. I wanted to inform you of a structural change at Volantech that may affect our compliance protocols. As of 2:07 a.m. Mountain Time, my role has transitioned from EVP of Legal and Financial Compliance to Strategic Advisor. As you know, this constitutes a material change in compliance leadership under Section 17.4b of our agreement. I'm working to ensure continuity, but wanted to alert you immediately as required by our transparency commitments. Please let me know if you need any additional documentation. Best regards, Evelyn." No accusations, no editorializing, just facts that would trigger an avalanche. The second email went to Lim Wei Chen, despite sharing a similar surname sound. She was definitely not related to anyone named Chen. Being from an old Singaporean banking family, she ran compliance for Meridian Bank's Asian operations and had the personality of a Swiss watch, precise, reliable, and unforgiving of any deviation from schedule. "Dear Wei Chen," I wrote, checking my calendar, "I realize I may have difficulty completing the monthly verification cycle scheduled for March 30th due to an unexpected role change at Volantech. Effective immediately, I've been transitioned to an advisory position, which may impact my system access for cryptographic signatures. I wanted to notify you within the 24-hour window specified in our agreement to ensure full transparency. I've copied our internal audit team for awareness. Warm regards, Evelyn." I didn't copy internal audit. I copied Sarah Martinez personally, knowing she'd forward it in panic to anyone who would listen. The beauty of corporate email chains was that they created their own momentum, each forward adding another layer of "I tried to warn you" to the eventual investigation file. The third email required more delicacy. Martin Fitzgerald at the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority wasn't technically supposed to be on my direct contact list. Our correspondence existed in a gray area not improper, but not exactly standard protocol. We developed this relationship over years of careful cultivation, built on our mutual interest in preventing Volantech from becoming another cautionary tale. "Martin," I wrote, dropping the formal salutation we both knew was meaningless. "Significant structural changes at VT overnight. My role has shifted to advisory capacity, which triggers several of the scenarios we discussed in our November meeting. I'll be filing the formal CM7 notification within the required 48-hour window, but wanted to give you advance notice per our informal agreement. The new leadership seems unaware of the automatic provisions in place. Documents attached for your review. E." I attached 43 pages of compliance documentation, each one stamped with digital signatures that would prove, beyond any doubt, that I'd followed every required protocol. Martin would have his team reviewing them within an hour, and by lunch Cayman time, Volantech's holdings would be under microscope-level scrutiny. But it was the fourth email that was my masterpiece. This one went to someone who technically didn't exist in any official capacity, Alexandra Volkov, a forensic accountant who worked for no agency, belonged to no organization, but somehow managed to appear wherever financial malfeasance was about to be exposed. She was a ghost in the machine of international finance, and she owed me a favor from 2011 when I'd provided documentation that helped her expose a massive tax evasion scheme. I typed, knowing she'd appreciate brevity. "The patient we discussed is about to experience organ failure. Thought you might want to observe. Timeline attached. The attachment was a single page showing the cascade of triggers about to hit Volantech, with timestamps and jurisdictions laid out like a train schedule. Alexandra would understand. More importantly, she'd position herself to watch it happen, and when it did, she'd know exactly which rocks to look under. I saved drafts of 3 more emails but didn't send them yet. These would go to journalists at the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and Reuters reporters I'd cultivated over the years by being a reliable source who never burned them with false information. They trusted me because I'd never cried wolf. When I finally did, they'd come running. My phone buzzed again. Sarah Martinez was descending into full panic. Evelyn, I've been trying to reach Chase for an hour. No response. I've called an emergency compliance meeting for 7 a.m., but I don't know if we can move fast enough. The Zurich provisions alone. Jesus, did you really give them unilateral freeze authority? Standard risk mitigation, I replied. The board approved it in 2018. Chase signed off on the renewal last quarter. That last part was particularly satisfying. Chase had indeed signed off on the renewal, along with dozens of other documents I'd placed in his pile during a board meeting. He'd been too busy live tweeting about crushing Q4 goals to read what he was signing. Can you stop it? Sarah asked. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Could I stop it, technically? Yes, I still had the codes, the passwords, the authority at least for another few hours until IT got around to revoking my access. I could send the verifications, file the notifications, keep the machinery running smoothly. I'm not sure my advisory role includes that level of operational involvement. I typed instead. Perhaps Chase has someone else in mind to handle these responsibilities. I wouldn't want to overstep my new boundaries. It wasn't cruel. It was just the natural consequence of decisions made in the dark, of messages sent at 2:07 a.m., of thinking that compliance was a cost center rather than a profit protection center. I glanced at the clock. 6 hours until Zurich opened, 7 until Hong Kong, 8 until Singapore. Each market would wake up to find Volantech's accounts in lockdown, triggered by automatic provisions that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The irony was delicious. Chase loved to talk about automation, about AI replacing human workers, about systems that could run themselves. Well, I'd built him exactly that, an automated compliance system so sophisticated it would destroy the company without any human intervention at all. My laptop chimed softly. New email. Sender blocked. I smiled. That would be it. Finally getting around to starting my access revocation. Too late, of course. Everything that mattered had already been sent from servers they didn't control using credentials they didn't know existed. I pulled up one final email. This one to my personal attorney, Rebecca Hartman, a former Southern District of New York prosecutor who'd switched to white-collar defense and never lost her taste for taking down corporate wrongdoing. Rebecca, I wrote, the matter we discussed is progressing as anticipated. I'll need you on standby starting tomorrow morning. Retainer attached. E. The retainer was substantial $200,000 of my personal funds, earned through 2 decades of bonuses that I'd saved while Chase's predecessors spent theirs on Tesla options and vacation homes. It would be more than enough to handle the inevitable lawsuits, the attempts to scapegoat me, the desperate legal maneuvers of a dying company trying to blame its executioner. But they wouldn't find an executioner. They'd find a mirror, reflecting back every decision they'd made, every warning they'd ignored, every time they'd chosen growth over governance. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Denver was waking up, the morning light catching the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere in one of those towers, Chase Loring was probably just rolling out of bed, checking his phone for overnight metrics, preparing for another day of disruption. He had no idea that the disruption had already begun, that while he'd slept, the woman he'd dismissed as outdated software had initiated a shutdown sequence that would make Y2K look like a minor glitch. In 6 hours, his phone would start ringing. Board members, investors, reporters, regulators all wanting to know why Volantech's assets were frozen across 6 jurisdictions. why their banking partners were invoking emergency provisions, why the compliance framework he'd inherited and ignored had turned into a noose. And somewhere in that chaos, someone would ask the inevitable question, "Where's Evelyn?" Strategic advisor. He'd tell them, "She's a strategic advisor now." They'd learn soon enough that I'd been strategic, all right, strategic enough to know that in the game of corporate chess, the queen isn't the most powerful piece because of how she moves. She's the most powerful because of what happens to the king when she's removed from the board. The morning stretched before me like an empty canvas. For the first time in 19 years, I had nowhere to be at 8 a.m., no fires to put out, no executives to save from themselves. I dressed carefully anyway. Charcoal gray suit, cream silk blouse, the Cartier watch my team had given me when I made EVP. If investigators or reporters came calling, I would look like what I was, a professional who'd been unexpectedly sidelined, not a disgruntled employee plotting revenge. I chose my usual coffee shop, the one on 17th Street where half of Denver's financial district grabbed their morning caffeine. Visibility mattered. When the story broke, witnesses would remember seeing me here, calm and composed, reading a book instead of frantically working my phone like someone orchestrating a crisis. The book was The Smartest Guys in the Room, the Enron story. I'd read it a dozen times, but the irony was too perfect to resist. If anyone asked, I'd say I was researching governance failures for my new advisory role. Let them make of that what they would. The usual, Evelyn Maria, the barista who'd been serving me for 5 years, already had my cortado started. "Make it a double today," I said, smiling, celebrating a career change. Her face lit up. "A promotion about time, you work harder than anyone I know." "Something like that," I said, leaving a $20 tip. Small kindnesses mattered, especially when you were about to burn down the tower you'd helped build. I found my usual corner table, one with clear sightlines to both entrances, and the financial news ticker that ran constantly on the mounted TV, currently showing markets open higher on tech optimism. That would change soon enough. My personal phone, not the company device. It would remotely wipe within hours, buzzed occasionally. Sarah Martinez, increasingly frantic. 2 board members who'd apparently just learned about my transition. Even Marcus, my old CEO, checking in from Aspen with characteristic understatement. "Heard about the change. Chase is an idiot. Let me know if you need anything." I responded to none of them. Today was not a day for digital trails beyond what I'd carefully crafted. Today was a day for watching the inevitable unfold, with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment they'd set in motion years ago. At 8:45 a.m., I opened my personal laptop and pulled up the document I'd been saving for 3 years. Corporate Governance in the Age of Disruption, a Case Study. 20,000 words examining how modern tech companies systematically dismantled the very safeguards designed to protect them. All theory. Of course, all hypothetical, nothing that could be construed as insider information. But soon it would read like prophecy. I was halfway through editing the section on international banking regulations when I spotted a familiar figure through the window. David Kim, Volantech's chief technology officer, the only C-suite executive besides me who'd been there since the early days. He was walking fast, phone pressed to his ear, his usually perfect hair disheveled. Our eyes met through the glass. He stopped, said something into his phone, then pushed through the door. "Evelyn," he stood by my table, uncertain. David and I had always maintained professional distance, 2 islands of competence in a sea of corporate chaos. "I heard about the change." "Strategic advisor," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Apparently my strategic advice is more valuable when it's not cluttering up the org chart." He sat heavily, signaling Maria for coffee. "Chase is making a mistake. The whole board's lost their minds if they think—" He stopped, studying my face. "You don't look surprised." "I've been in this business for 20 years. David, very little surprises me anymore." "Sarah Martinez is having a meltdown," he said, lowering his voice. "Something about banking triggers and frozen assets. She says we could lose access to operational capital in multiple jurisdictions. Says you're the only one who understands the full compliance structure. I took a sip of my cortado. Perfect temperature, perfect foam. I'm sure Chase has it handled. He's very hands-on, as you know. David's laugh was bitter. Chase couldn't handle a lemonade stand's compliance requirements. He's been in the office since 6, calling banks, calling lawyers, calling everyone except you. My new role doesn't include operational responsibilities, I said. I wouldn't want to overstep. Cut the bullshit, Evelyn. David leaned forward, his engineer's mind already connecting dots. You built those triggers, didn't you? All those banking agreements, all those compliance frameworks. You built them to fail if you weren't there to maintain them. I met his gaze steadily. I built them to protect Volantech from regulatory catastrophe. The fact that they require competent oversight to function isn't a bug. David, it's a feature. He sat back, processing. David had survived every leadership change by being brilliant and keeping his head down, but he was also one of the few who understood that architecture, whether in code or compliance, always reflected the architect's intentions. How bad is it going to get? He asked finally. I closed my laptop, considering my words carefully. David wasn't my enemy. He was collateral damage, like the hundreds of engineers and analysts and support staff who'd built something real while Chase played CEO. Remember the story Marcus used to tell, I said, about the old data center that ran perfectly for years until someone decided to upgrade the cooling system without understanding why it was designed that way. David nodded. The whole thing overheated and crashed. Took 3 days to get back online. This will take longer than 3 days, I said. His phone buzzed, then again, then a third time in rapid succession. He glanced at it and paled. Hong Kong office, the Asian Development Fund accounts are... Jesus, Evelyn. You should probably take that, I said gently. He stood, then paused. For what it's worth, I told the board keeping you was more important than keeping Chase. They said I didn't understand the big picture. You understand it fine, I said. You just build things. They break things. Sometimes what breaks can't be fixed. After he left, I returned to my laptop, adding a new chapter to my governance paper. The automation paradox, when systems designed to reduce human error become dependent on human expertise. It was therapeutic, transforming lived experience into academic analysis, turning today's crisis into tomorrow's business school case study. At 9:20 a.m., the financial news ticker changed. Breaking Volantech Systems reports technical difficulties with international banking partners. Technical difficulties, I almost laughed, like calling a hurricane unusual weather. My phone rang, unknown number, likely a reporter who'd somehow gotten my personal cell. I let it go to voicemail, then another, then another. The media smelled blood in the water, and they were circling. But it was the text from an unlisted number that made me smile. A magnificent. The patient is flatlining exactly as predicted. The post-mortem will be illuminating. Alexandra Volkov, watching from whatever shadow she inhabited. Seeing the patterns I'd woven years ago finally revealing themselves. She understood what the reporters didn't yet. This wasn't a technical glitch or a banking error. This was a controlled demolition. Every charge placed with precision. The building falling exactly into its own footprint. I flagged down Maria for another cortado. It was going to be a long day of doing absolutely nothing while Rome burned, but at least I had good coffee and a front row seat to the show. The book lay open beside me, a passage underlined from years ago. The Enron executives believed they were the smartest guys in the room. They were wrong. The smartest person is often the one who builds the room, knows where all the exits are, and leaves before someone sets it on fire. I hadn't set the fire. Chase had done that with every reckless decision, every ignored warning, every time he'd chosen disruption over diligence. I just made sure that when the fire started, the sprinkler system would be mysteriously offline. Is this seat taken? I looked up to find a woman in her 30s. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, holding a recorder, Financial Times, if I had to guess from the accent. I'm not giving interviews, I said pleasantly. I'm not asking for one, she replied, sitting anyway. I'm just curious why Volantech's former head of compliance is sitting in a coffee shop reading about Enron while her company's assets are being frozen across 6 time zones. Former. I raised an eyebrow. I'm a strategic advisor now. Says so right in the announcement that went out at 2:07 this morning. She smiled. Predator recognizing predator. Of course, strategic, like the strategic placement of explosives before a building demolition. That's a very dramatic metaphor, I said, returning to my book. I prefer to think of it as strategic architecture. Build something properly, maintain it carefully, and it stands forever. Neglect the maintenance, ignore the architect's warnings, decide you don't need the architect anymore. The building falls down, she finished. Gravity is very reliable that way, I agreed. She stood, leaving a business card on the table. When you're ready to tell your side of the story, call me. Something tells me it'll be worth waiting for. After she left, I glanced at the ticker again. Volantech's pre-IPO valuation had dropped 12% in 30 minutes. By market close, it would be a bloodbath. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt what I'd always felt in this job, the grim satisfaction of being proven right about risks everyone else ignored. The only difference was that this time, I wouldn't be there to clean up the mess. Chase Loring had wanted to move fast and break things. Mission accomplished. At 10:32 a.m., the first domino fell. I watched it happen in real time on my laptop, logged into the public-facing banking portals that anyone could access if they knew where to look. The Zurich account's $2.3 billion in operational reserves flipped from active to compliance hold, pending review. A simple status change that might as well have been a nuclear detonation in Volantech's financial infrastructure. The coffee shop's TV, still tuned to financial news, hadn't caught up yet. They were still running feel-good stories about tech sector growth, but I could see the future unfolding in the banking portals, in the cascade of automatic notifications being generated by systems I designed to be helpful, transparent, and absolutely ruthless in their adherence to protocol. My phone, set to silent, lit up like a Christmas tree. 47 missed calls in 5 minutes. I recognized most of the number's board members, executives, our primary law firm. One number appeared 8 times Chase Loring's personal cell. The fact that he was calling me directly, not having an assistant do it, told me everything about his state of mind. At 10:41, Singapore joined the party. Meridian Bank's portal showed their own terse message. Account access suspended pending compliance verification. Estimated resolution time 15 to 20 business days. 15 to 20 business days. I'd helped Lim Wei Chen craft that language myself. Long enough to conduct a thorough review, short enough to avoid accusations of bad faith. Of course, if additional issues were discovered during the review, and they would be, given Chase's creative approach to documentation, that timeline could extend indefinitely. At 10:47, Hong Kong delivered the killing blow. Not just a freeze, but an escalation. Suspicious activity detected. Mandatory reporting to Hong Kong Monetary Authority initiated. All associated accounts frozen pending investigation. Suspicious activity, the beautiful ambiguity of that phrase. It could mean anything from actual fraud to simple paperwork discrepancies. But in the current climate, with Chinese regulators looking for any excuse to crack down on American fintech companies, it was a death sentence. The investigation alone would take months, maybe years. The reputational damage was immediate and irreversible. "Excuse me, are you Evelyn Ward?" A young man stood beside my table, sweating despite the cool morning air. His Volantech fleece jacket and panicked expression marked him as clearly as a name tag would have. "I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met," I said pleasantly. "I'm Jake, from Mr. Loring sent me to find you. He says it's urgent, about the banking situation. He needs you at the office right away." Poor Jake. Probably pulled off whatever project he'd been working on, told to physically track down the one person who could stop the bleeding. Chase must have been desperate to resort to sending foot messengers like some medieval king. "I appreciate you coming all this way," I said, noting how several other patrons were now watching our interaction. "But I'm afraid my advisory role doesn't include emergency response. Mr. Loring has my email if he'd like to schedule a consultation." "He said to tell you he'll agree to any terms," Jake pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. "Full reinstatement, salary increase, whatever you want. Just please come help fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said gently. "The systems are working exactly as designed. The compliance protocols are following their programmed parameters. Everything is functioning perfectly. But the money is safely protected from any potential regulatory violations," I finished. "The banks are simply being cautious, as they should be. I'm sure once Mr. Loring provides all the necessary documentation and verification, everything will be resolved. The process usually takes 4 to 6 weeks, assuming no complications." Jake's face went pale. 4 to 6 weeks. Per jurisdiction, I clarified. So with 6 jurisdictions involved, and assuming they don't find any issues that trigger extended investigations, well, I'm sure Mr. Loring has factored that into his business continuity planning. The boy practically ran from the coffee shop, presumably to deliver the bad news that the former compliance queen wouldn't be riding to the rescue. I felt a twinge of sympathy for him. Jake hadn't created this mess. He was just another employee about to discover what happened when leadership confused moving fast with moving smart. At 11:02 a.m., the financial news caught up. The ticker changed to "Alert Volantech Systems Trading Halted Pending Clarification of International Banking Issues." Trading halted. The pre-IPO shares that Chase had been hyping to private investors were now frozen, just like the assets. Investors who'd bought in at a $40 billion valuation were watching their stakes become worthless in real time. My laptop chimed. New email. Sender Sarah Martinez. "Evelyn, the Cayman authorities are demanding documentation I don't have. They're asking about something called the CM7 protocols and saying we're already in violation of the 48-hour notification window. I can't find any record of these protocols in our systems. Please, I know you're angry about the demotion, but people's jobs are at stake. Can you at least tell me where to find the documentation?" I started to type a response, then stopped. Sarah was competent and well-meaning, but she'd also been in the room when the decision was made to demote me. She'd had the opportunity to speak up, to question the wisdom of removing the person who understood the intricate web of international compliance. She'd chosen silence. Instead, I typed, "The CM7 protocols are detailed in the Cayman Compliance Manual, which should be in the shared legal drive under International Agreements, Caribbean Banking. Regulatory requirements. However, you'll need Level 9 access to view them, which was restricted to the EVP of Compliance. I'm not sure if my advisory role includes those permissions. Best of luck." It didn't. I'd confirmed that hours ago. My Level 9 access had been revoked at exactly 2:07 a.m., the same moment my demotion was announced, which meant no one currently at Volantech could access the documentation the Cayman authorities required. By the time they figured out how to restore access or recreate the documents, they'd be so far out of compliance that the penalties would be astronomical. The TV above the counter finally switched to breaking news. A harried-looking anchor was explaining that Volantech, once valued at $40 billion, was experiencing what she carefully called significant operational challenges related to international banking compliance. Then came the number that made even my cynical heart skip. Sources indicate that approximately $4.7 billion in assets across 6 jurisdictions have been frozen or restricted, effectively eliminating the company's operational capital. $4.7 billion. They'd found all of it, every account, every reserve, every carefully squirreled away fund that companies use to weather storms. All of it now locked behind compliance walls that I'd built brick by brick, regulation by regulation, relationship by relationship. More coffee. Maria appeared at my elbow, pod in hand. "I think I'll switch to tea," I said. "Something calming. It's been an eventful morning." She glanced at the TV. then at me, making the connection. Is that your company, the one with all the frozen money? Former company, I corrected. I'm in an advisory capacity now. Advisors don't have to deal with that mess. Apparently not. She laughed. Best promotion ever, then. As she walked away, I reflected on the irony. Chase had thought he was parking me in a powerless position, neutralizing a threat to his vision of unfettered growth. Instead, he'd freed me from any obligation to prevent the catastrophe while leaving me perfectly positioned to observe it. At 11:23 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, I recognized the number Martin Fitzgerald from the Cayman authorities. Professional courtesy demanded I answer this one. Martin, I said warmly, I assume you received my notification. Evelyn, his voice was carefully neutral. I did indeed. I also received a rather panicked call from someone claiming to be Volantech's new head of compliance, insisting you're no longer authorized to communicate with regulatory bodies. How interesting, I said. I wasn't aware Chase had appointed a replacement so quickly. Who is it? That's the thing, Martin said, and I could hear the suppressed amusement in his voice. He appointed himself, apparently, Mr. Loring is now CEO and head of compliance, which, as you know, violates about 15 different regulations regarding separation of duties. I finished. Oh dear. Oh dear, indeed. I'm afraid this raises additional concerns about Volantech's governance structure. We'll need to expand our review accordingly. I understand completely, I said. I'm happy to provide any historical documentation that might help, though I should note that my current advisory role may limit my ability to speak on behalf of the company. Of course. Speaking of which, in your personal capacity, do you happen to know why Volantech failed to file the required CM7 notification within the mandated window? I smiled. I couldn't say. Martin, though I did send an email to current management explaining the requirement, perhaps it got lost in the shuffle of my transition. Transitions can be so disruptive, he agreed. We'll add it to the list of items requiring clarification. Have a good day. Evelyn, I suspect we'll be in touch. After he hung up, I made a note in my personal log. Chase had just made the classic amateur mistake thinking that titles gave you knowledge. He could call himself head of compliance, but that didn't mean he understood what compliance actually required. It was like declaring yourself a surgeon and then wondering why the patient kept bleeding. The news had shifted to showing Volantech's Denver headquarters, where employees were gathering in confused clusters outside the building. Someone had leaked that keycards weren't working a standard security protocol when financial irregularities triggered building-wide lockdowns. Another one of my designs, actually, implemented after a competitor had experienced insider trading. $4.7 billion frozen. Stock trading halted. Employees locked out of their own building. International investigations launched in 6 jurisdictions. All because a boy CEO thought he could run a fintech company without the woman who'd built its financial infrastructure. I closed my laptop and gathered my things. The show would continue, but I'd seen enough for one morning. The rest, the lawsuits, the investigations, the desperate attempts to unfreeze assets that were locked behind compliance requirements Chase didn't even know existed would play out over weeks and months. But the war was already over. It had been over the moment Chase typed that message at 2:07 a.m. He just hadn't known it yet. By 4 p.m., Chase Loring had called 17 times. I knew because I'd been counting, watching my phone light up with increasing desperation. The 18th call came as I was settling into my home office, a glass of wine at hand, and the preliminary SEC filing documents spread across my desk documents I'd pulled from public records. Nothing that violated any confidentiality agreements. This time, I answered. Evelyn, his voice cracked on my name. The Golden Boy CEO who'd strutted through the hallways preaching disruption now sounded like a frightened child. Thank God, we need to talk. I activated the recording app on my laptop, another habit from 20 years in corporate warfare. Always document everything, especially conversations with desperate executives. Hello, Chase, I said evenly. I understand you've had a challenging day. Challenging. a laugh that bordered on hysteria. Evelyn, our entire operational capital is frozen. The SEC just launched a formal investigation. 3 board members have already resigned. The Saudis are threatening to pull their entire investment. This is beyond challenging. This is an extinction-level event. I see. I took a sip of wine, a nice Bordeaux I'd been saving for a special occasion. And how can a strategic advisor help with this situation? Silence. I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. In the background, voices argued probably his inner circle of Stanford bros discovering that their MBAs hadn't prepared them for actual crises. Cut the shit, Evelyn. His voice hardened, trying to find that CEO authority that had worked so well in board meetings. You did this. You built these triggers, these freezes, these traps throughout our entire financial system. I built a robust compliance framework designed to protect Volantech from regulatory action, I corrected. The fact that it requires competent oversight isn't a trap. Chase, it's a feature. You knew this would happen if you were removed. I knew it would happen if the compliance infrastructure was neglected, I said. Whether that was through my removal or simple incompetence was always an open question. You seem to have chosen both. Another silence. Then, what do you want? The question I'd been waiting for. The moment when the king realizes he's in checkmate and starts trying to negotiate surrender terms. What do I want? I repeated, letting the question hang. Chase, what I wanted was to do my job. What I wanted was to protect the company I'd helped build from regulatory disaster. What I wanted was to be treated with the respect that 19 years of service had earned. I'll give you all of that, he said quickly. Full reinstatement, doubled salary, board seat, whatever title you want. Just please, tell me how to unfreeze these accounts. I laughed, genuinely amused. You think this is about money, about titles? Chase, I have enough money. I had a title. What I don't have is any obligation to clean up messes created by executives who thought compliance was optional. People are going to lose their jobs, he pressed. Good people, innocent people, who had nothing to do with this decision. Don't you care about them? The emotional manipulation was clumsy but not entirely wrong. I did care about the employees, the engineers like David Kim, the analysts, the support staff who'd built something real while Chase played startup messiah. I cared about them when I warned the board about your regulatory violations, I said. I cared about them when I documented every risk in 17-page memos you didn't read. I cared about them when I built systems to protect the company from exactly this scenario. You're the one who disabled those protections by removing me. So you admit it, he said, and I could hear the desperate hope in his voice. You admit you built these systems to fail without you. That's corporate sabotage. That's illegal. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Is it show me the law that says compliance systems can't require specific expertise to maintain? Show me the regulation that says I'm obligated to build frameworks that function without qualified oversight. I'll wait. More background arguing. I heard someone say, extortion, and someone else respond with, she's got a point. Evelyn, Chase tried again, his voice shifting to what he probably thought was persuasive. I'm sorry about how this was handled. The 2A notification. The demotion, it was poorly done. I see that now. But we can fix this. We can work together. We could have worked together, I agreed. But you chose disruption over collaboration. You chose to move fast and break things. Congratulations, you succeeded. You're enjoying this, accusation crept into his tone. You're sitting there watching the company burn and you're enjoying it. I considered the accusation. Was I enjoying it? Not exactly. What I felt was the grim satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled, of warnings ignored coming to their inevitable conclusion. It was the feeling of watching someone insist on touching a hot stove after you'd explained, repeatedly, that it would burn them. I'm observing the natural consequences of your decisions, I said. Whether I enjoy it or not is irrelevant. The banks don't care about my emotional state. The regulators don't care. The frozen assets don't care. This isn't personal. Chase, it's just math. Math, he repeated bitterly. Yes, math, the mathematical certainty that complex systems fail when you remove critical components. You thought I was a cost center to be optimized away. You discovered I was a load-bearing wall. So what happens now? The fight had gone out of his voice. Do I just watch it all collapse? That's your choice, I said. You can start by actually reading the compliance documentation. Sarah Martinez has been trying to help, but she lacks the background and, apparently, the access levels. You could hire external consultants, though anyone qualified will take one look at the situation and demand a very large retainer up front. Or you could resign. Let the board appoint someone competent to clean up your mess. Take your golden parachute and go disrupt some other industry, maybe one with less regulation. They'd hire you back, he said immediately. If I resigned, the board would beg you to come back. Possibly, I admitted. But my consulting rates have gone up considerably in the last 14 hours. This is extortion, he said again, but without conviction. No, Chase, extortion would be if I demanded something to fix the problems. I'm not demanding anything. I'm not offering anything. I'm just a strategic advisor. Remember, my advice is strategic. Next time you inherit a complex system you don't understand, don't fire the person who built it. You're really going to let it all burn, everything you spent 20 years building. I looked at the documents on my desk, the IPO filing that would never happen, the expansion plans that would never materialize, the promises to investors that would never be kept. I didn't light the fire, Chase. I just built in fire suppression systems that require maintenance. You're the one who decided maintenance was optional. Fuck you, Evelyn. The mask finally slipped completely. Fuck your sanctimonious bullshit. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a bitter old woman who couldn't handle being pushed aside for someone with actual vision. There it is, I said calmly. The real Chase Loring, the one who sends termination notices at 2 a.m. because he's too cowardly to face people in daylight, the one who thinks vision means ignoring laws that inconvenience him, that Chase was always going to destroy Volantech. I just made sure it happened fast enough that you couldn't take everyone else down with you. I'll sue you, he threatened. I'll sue you for everything you have. Get in line, I suggested. I imagine you'll have quite a few lawsuits to deal with first. The investors who bought in at $40 billion valuation, the employees whose stock options are now worthless, the regulators in 6 jurisdictions. But sure, add me to the list. My attorney would love the billable hours. He hung up without another word. I carefully saved the recording, then emailed it to Rebecca Hartman with a note. As discussed, please retain for potential future proceedings. The wine was excellent, worth every penny of the $300 I'd paid for it. Outside my window, Denver's financial district glittered in the setting sun. Somewhere in one of those towers, Chase Loring was discovering what happened when you confuse destruction with disruption. My phone buzzed. A text from David Kim. Bar in an hour, I'm buying. We have a lot of former Volantech employees who want to thank you for the warning shots you've been firing for years. I smiled and typed back, make it 2 hours. I have one more call to make. The call was to Hans Gruber in Zurich. It was past midnight his time, but I knew he'd be awake, watching the American financial news with the fascination of someone viewing a car accident from a safe distance. Evelyn, he answered on the first ring. I've been expecting your call. Hello, Hans. I wanted to personally thank you for following the protocols we established. I know it must have been a difficult decision. His laugh was dry. Difficult. My dear Evelyn, it was the easiest decision I've made all year. When I saw the notification about your role change, I knew exactly what was happening. Another American CEO thinking he can ignore the rules because he has a vision. Still, I appreciate your diligence. It's not diligence, Hans said. It's self-preservation. We've seen too many American companies implode from regulatory violations. The protocols you insisted on weren't just protecting Volantech, they were protecting us from Volantech. We talked for a few more minutes about the state of international banking, the importance of compliance, the way Americans always seem surprised when laws applied to them. Before hanging up, Hans said something that would stay with me. You know, Evelyn, in Switzerland we have a saying, the avalanche has already started. It is too late for the pebbles to vote. Your Mr. Loring thought he could vote. He's about to learn that gravity doesn't care about democracy. After the call, I poured another glass of wine and returned to my governance paper. Chapter 7. The Compliance Paradox. When protection becomes prosecution. It would make fascinating reading for the next generation of business students. A cautionary tale about the importance of understanding what you're destroying before you destroy it. Chase Loring had wanted to disrupt the financial industry. In a way, he'd succeeded. Just not the way he'd intended. The SEC arrived at 9:15 a.m. the next morning. Not at Volantech's headquarters, those were still locked down. Yellow tape across the entrances like a crime scene. They came to my house. 2 investigators in conservative suits carrying leather portfolios and the kind of carefully neutral expressions that meant serious business. Ms. Ward, the lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying temples, held up her credentials. I'm Special Agent Sarah Delacroix with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is Agent Martinez. We'd like to ask you some questions about Volantech systems. I'd been expecting them since dawn, dressed appropriately in business attire. My attorney, Rebecca Hartman, already present and sipping coffee in my living room. Of course, I said, stepping aside. Please come in. Can I offer you coffee tea? They declined, but I noticed Agent Delacroix's slight approval at the offer. Courtesy mattered in these situations. The small acknowledgement that we were all professionals doing our jobs. We settled in my living room, Rebecca positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. The agents pulled out digital recorders and notebooks, their movements synchronized from long practice. Ms. Ward, Agent Delacroix began, we understand you were recently transitioned from Executive Vice President of Legal and Financial Compliance to a strategic advisor role at Volantech. Can you tell us about that change? I received notification of the role change at 2:07 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I said, keeping my voice neutral. The message came through the company's internal system. No explanation was provided. And what were your responsibilities as EVP of Compliance? I smiled slightly. Would you like the short version or the complete list? I maintained a detailed responsibility matrix that runs approximately 70 pages. Agent Martinez looked up from his notes. You maintained personal documentation of your responsibilities. I maintained personal documentation of everything, I said. 20 years in compliance teaches you the value of thorough records. Rebecca touched my arm lightly, a reminder to answer only what was asked. But I wanted these agents to understand something from the start. I had nothing to hide because I'd done nothing wrong. Ms. Ward, Delacroix continued, we're investigating potential securities fraud related to Volantech's planned IPO. Our preliminary review suggests significant discrepancies between public statements and actual financial positions. As head of compliance, were you aware of any efforts to misrepresent the company's financial status? I documented my concerns extensively, I said. On February 15th, I submitted a 17-page memo to CEO Chase Loring and the board of directors detailing potential regulatory violations in the S1 preparation. Would you like a copy? The agents exchanged glances. You retained copies of internal communications. Rebecca intervened smoothly. My client maintained personal records of all compliance-related documentation, as is standard practice for senior executives in regulated industries. We're happy to provide relevant materials that don't violate attorney-client privilege or legitimate trade secrets. That would be helpful, Delacroix said. Then, to me, Ms. Ward, can you explain the current situation with Volantech's frozen assets? This was the delicate part. I chose my words carefully. Volantech maintained banking relationships in 6 international jurisdictions. Each relationship included compliance protocols designed to protect against regulatory violations. These protocols were approved by the board and have been in place for several years. And these protocols were triggered by your departure. The protocols were triggered by a material change in compliance leadership, I corrected. The banking agreements specified that certain conditions, including sudden changes in oversight structure, would initiate protective measures. This is standard risk mitigation in international finance. But you designed these protocols, Martinez pressed. You must have known what would happen if you were removed. Rebecca started to object, but I raised a hand slightly. This was important. Agent Martinez, I designed protocols that would protect Volantech and its banking partners from regulatory exposure. The fact that those protocols require competent oversight isn't a flaw, it's the entire point. Would you trust a nuclear power plant that could run without qualified operators? That's not quite the same thing, he said. Isn't it Volantech handles billions in international transactions? The regulatory requirements are complex and constantly evolving. The systems I built assumed there would always be qualified compliance leadership. Mr. Loring's decision to operate without that leadership triggered exactly the protections the banks demanded. Delacroix leaned forward. Ms. Ward, did you take any actions after your role change to ensure these protocols would trigger? This was the key question, the one that would determine whether I was a witness or a target. I took several actions, I said clearly. I notified our banking partners of the leadership change. As required by our agreements, I informed internal audit of the situation and provided documentation of all compliance requirements. I responded to inquiries from regulatory bodies. Every action I took was consistent with my ongoing fiduciary duties and the legal requirements of the jurisdictions in which Volantech operates. You didn't try to prevent the asset freezes. I had no authority to prevent them, I said. My new role as strategic advisor didn't include operational responsibilities or system access. More importantly, preventing the freezes would have required misrepresenting the situation to our banking partners, which would have been fraudulent. Rebecca added, my client's actions were not only legal, but required under the terms of the international banking agreements. Failure to notify the banks would have been a breach of contract and potentially criminal fraud. The agents made notes. Delacroix pulled out a tablet and showed me a document. This appears to be an email from you to several international contacts sent early Tuesday morning. Can you explain the timing? I looked at the email, one of my carefully crafted notifications to Hans Gruber in Zurich. I sent notifications immediately after learning of my role change. I said, the banking agreements required notification within specific timeframes, 24 hours for Zurich, 12 hours for Singapore. Given the time zone differences, immediate action was necessary to maintain compliance. At 2 in the morning, at 2:37 a.m. to be precise, I said, would you prefer I had waited until business hours and violated the notification requirements? Martinez tried another angle. Ms. Ward, some might see this as retaliation for your demotion. I met his gaze steadily. Agent Martinez, I spent 20 years building Volantech's compliance infrastructure. I prevented 3 federal investigations, saved the company millions in potential fines, and established banking relationships that enabled international expansion. If I wanted to retaliate, I could have done so at any point by simply not doing my job. Instead, I protected the company even when it didn't protect me. Then why let it collapse now? I didn't let it collapse, I said firmly. I was removed from the position that allowed me to prevent collapse. That's not the same thing. If you fire the pilot mid-flight, you can't blame them when the plane crashes. Delacroix shifted topics. We've received information suggesting CEO Chase Loring was aware of significant compliance issues, but chose to proceed with IPO preparations regardless. Do you have documentation supporting this? I glanced at Rebecca, who nodded. I have extensive documentation, I said. Emails, memos, recorded meetings where concerns were raised and dismissed. I also have evidence of attempts to circumvent regulatory requirements, requests to find workarounds for legal restrictions, and deliberate exclusion of compliance leadership from key decisions. The agent's interest sharpened visibly. This was what they'd come for, not to investigate me, but to build their case against Chase and his inner circle. We'll need copies of everything, Delacroix said. I'll coordinate with your office, Rebecca responded. Will provide all relevant materials while ensuring appropriate legal protections for Ms. Ward. The questions continued for another hour. Details about specific transactions, regulatory filings, board meetings where I'd raised concerns. Through it all, I maintained the same calm, professional demeanor that had served me for 2 decades. I wasn't defensive because I had nothing to defend. Every action I'd taken had been legal, ethical, and in many cases, legally required. As they prepared to leave, Agent Delacroix paused at the door. Ms. Ward, off the record, why didn't you just quit? Why stay and build all these safeguards if you knew the leadership didn't value compliance? I considered the question. Because I believed in what Volantech could be. I believed that eventually, responsible leadership would prevail. I was wrong about that, but I was right to build the safeguards. They're working exactly as intended. To destroy the company. To prevent the company from destroying others, I corrected. Every frozen dollar is a dollar that can't be used for fraud. Every investigation is a chance to expose wrongdoing before it spreads. The safeguards aren't destroying Volantech. They're performing an autopsy on something that was already dead. After they left, Rebecca poured herself more coffee and gave me a long look. That was masterfully done, she said. You're not a target, you're their star witness. Chase Loring is finished. He was finished the moment he thought he could run a financial services company without understanding financial regulations, I said. I just made sure he couldn't take innocent people down with him. My phone buzzed. A text from Alexandra Volkov. SEC raid on Volantech servers happening now. Your documentation trails are lighting up like Christmas trees. Magnificent work. I didn't respond. There was no need. The machinery of justice was in motion, grinding slowly but inevitably toward its conclusion. Chase Loring had wanted to disrupt the system. Instead, the system was about to disrupt him. Poetic justice, delivered at the speed of bureaucracy, the live stream began at 2 p.m. Pacific Time, exactly 1 week after my demotion. I'd chosen the timing deliberately peak hours for the financial press, optimal for East Coast coverage, and late enough that the Australian and Asian markets would catch the replay. I'd accepted the invitation from the Independent Financial Oversight Committee, a watchdog organization with a reputation for brutal transparency. They wanted my perspective on the Volantech collapse. More importantly, they had the platform to ensure my words wouldn't be edited, contextualized, or spun by corporate PR machines. The setup was simple, a clean background, professional lighting, and a microphone that would catch every word with crystal clarity. No notes, I didn't need them. The story I was about to tell had been written into my bones over 20 years. Ms. Ward, the interviewer began, her voice carefully neutral. You've been called both a corporate whistleblower and a saboteur. How do you respond to those characterizations? I looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere Chase Loring was watching. They all were every executive who'd ever confused motion with progress, every board member who'd prioritized growth over governance. I'm neither, I said simply. I'm an architect who built a house according to code. When the new owners decided to remove the foundation because they thought it was slowing down their renovations, the house fell down. That's not sabotage. That's physics. But you must have known what would happen when those banking protocols were triggered. Of course I knew, just as I knew what would happen if we violated SEC regulations, or failed to maintain international compliance standards, or tried to misrepresent our financial position to investors. The difference is, I tried to prevent those outcomes. Others saw them as acceptable risks. The interviewer pulled up a chart showing Volantech's timeline, the meteoric rise, the frozen assets, the ongoing investigations. Walk us through the critical decision point, she said. When did you realize the company was headed for disaster? February 15th, I answered without hesitation. When my 17-page memo documenting regulatory violations was dismissed as legacy thinking, that's when I knew the leadership had chosen a path that would end in either federal investigation or total collapse. The banking protocols I'd built simply ensured it would be collapse instead of criminal fraud. Some would say you had an obligation to prevent that collapse. I had an obligation to follow the law, I corrected. Every action I took was legally required under our banking agreements. The only way to prevent the collapse would have been to lie to regulators, mislead banking partners, and enable securities fraud. That's not prevention, that's complicity. The questions continued, each one an opportunity to lay out the facts with surgical precision. I explained the international banking relationships, the compliance requirements, the systematic dismantling of safeguards by leadership drunk on disruption mythology. Mr. Loring has claimed you built these systems as insurance for yourself, the interviewer noted. Insurance. I almost smiled. Insurance would have been a golden parachute, a non-compete clause, a severance package that bought silence. What I built was transparency. Every protocol, every safeguard, every automatic trigger was documented, approved by the board, and disclosed to banking partners. If that's insurance, then every building code is insurance for architects. What about the employees who lost their jobs, the investors who lost millions? This was the hardest question, the one that actually mattered. Every employee at Volantech was betrayed by leadership that prioritized mythology over mathematics, I said. Every investor was deceived by executives who thought regulations were suggestions. I documented these issues repeatedly. I warned the board. I built systems to prevent catastrophic failure. The tragedy isn't that those systems worked, it's that they had to. You sound angry. I'm not angry, I said, and realized it was true. I'm tired. Tired of watching the same story play out across corporate America. Tired of visionary leaders who can't see past their own PR. Tired of being called paranoid for pointing out that laws apply to everyone, even disruptors. The interviewer leaned forward. If you could send a message to other compliance officers, other architects as you call them, what would it be? I thought carefully before answering. Document everything. Build your safeguards with triggers that don't require your presence. And remember, you're not there to enable the fantasy. You're there to ensure that when reality arrives, it doesn't arrive with handcuffs. And to CEOs. Simple. The person who understands your compliance infrastructure isn't a cost center. They're the only thing standing between you and a federal investigation. Fire them at your own peril. As the interview wrapped up, the interviewer asked one final question. What's next for you, Ms. Ward? I've been fielding offers, I said. Companies that suddenly appreciate the value of competent compliance leadership. But first, I'm finishing a book on corporate governance in the age of disruption. Working title: The smartest person in the room is often the one who built it. Any regrets? I considered the question. Just one. I regret that it took the complete collapse of a $40 billion company to prove what I'd been saying for years. You can't disrupt your way around reality. You can't pivot away from prison, and you can't fire the person holding the keys and expect the doors to stay open. The live stream ended with a simple statement. My name is Evelyn Ward. I spent 20 years building Volantech's compliance infrastructure. It took Chase Loring less than 24 hours to discover why that infrastructure mattered. Sometimes the best revenge isn't breaking the rules. It's knowing them so well that when someone else breaks them, the consequences are automatic, inevitable, and entirely their own fault. Later that evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the metrics. The live stream had been viewed over 2 million times in 6 hours. The SEC had announced 17 additional charges against Chase Loring and his inner circle. 3 international regulatory bodies had launched their own investigations, and Volantech's assets remained frozen across 6 jurisdictions, awaiting resolution of investigations that would take years to complete. My laptop chimed with an encrypted message from Alexandra Volkov. Preliminary analysis complete. Total shareholder losses, $18.7 billion. Criminal charges filed 23 and counting. Executives facing potential prison time, 7. Time from your demotion to total collapse, 72 hours. Absolutely surgical. History will remember this as the Evelyn Ward Protocol, the controlled demolition of corporate malfeasance through malicious compliance with one's own safeguards. I closed the laptop and poured a final glass of wine. Through my window, Denver's financial district glittered in the darkness. Somewhere out there, in rented apartments and budget hotels, former Volantech executives were learning what happened when you confused breaking things with building value. Chase Loring had sent me a 2-word message at 2:07 a.m., effective immediately. I'd sent him one word back, understood. But understanding, I reflected, was exactly what he'd lacked. He'd understood disruption but not regulation, innovation but not obligation, speed but not structure. Most importantly, he'd never understood that in the architecture of corporate compliance, every beam is load-bearing, every safeguard is essential, and the person who built the system is the last person you should remove from it. The wine was excellent, the night was quiet, and somewhere in a federal detention center, Chase Loring was learning that orange jumpsuits don't come in designer cuts. I raised my glass to the window, a silent toast to every compliance officer who'd been dismissed as overcautious, every risk manager labeled as old-fashioned, every voice of reason drowned out by the chorus of disruption. We were the ones who knew where the bodies were buried, because we were the ones who'd drawn the maps. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Share our thoughts about Evelyn's journey in the world of corporate revenge. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And if you really want to help this story reach more listeners who might need to hear it, press that hype button to boost it in the algorithm. Your support means everything. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply knowing the rules better than those who break them.